Today we'll be talking about recurring villains. Thank you very much, those of you who are returning from yesterday with building a better villain. And so I am curious. Yesterday I had asked about some real major memorable villains. And I'm curious if any of you have thoughts about recurring villains where you're like, oh yes, they were the villain of like the whole series and they were so great or fantastic. If anybody had any thoughts or suggestions, yes? How did I know? Indeed, Jesse and James, and I love Team Rocket, as indeed we all, or at least I hope you do. Yes, Jesse and James from Team Rocket. What an amazing pair of, and I guess they are indeed villains, and they do recur, just so they can blast off again. Yes. Any other recurring villains? Yes.
Okay, so I've never actually seen it, but I've seen a video about Castlevania.
Castlevania.
Yeah.
Are you referring to Dracula then as the recurring villain? Indeed, both from the series, he's kind of like the background big bad, but also from, of course, the series of video games themselves. What is a man? A pitiful pile of secrets. It was not by my hand that I was once again given... No, I can't. You monster. Yes. Zod? Oh, Khan. Oh, Star Trek. Yes, that makes a lot more sense. Zod wasn't in Star Trek. Nor was he really a recurring villain, but Khan, was he recurring? He showed up twice. That's enough to recur. Yeah, all right, three times. Yes. Either one, both of you. The homunculus from Full Metal Alchemist, which I am not personally familiar with, but I assume an excellent example. Yes.
Dr. Eggman/Dr. Robotnik from the Sonic universe.
Of course, constantly going after those Chaos Emeralds, changing weight and names. Sometimes he's Eggman, sometimes he's Robotnik. I never quite followed that. But yeah, absolutely. Video games, many of those early video games have those recurring villains because you had to have multiple installments, right? Koopa as well, in his own way. Yes?
So how long does it have to recur? If each season had a different overarching, does each of them not count? I'm not here to be pedantic. I'm just here to break it all down into tiny pieces. Nox from Wakfu. It's a French series. Yeah.
Well, bonsoir. Yeah, Nox. All right, and certainly, and to answer your actual question, yeah, if it's more than an episode, more than a series, absolutely, yeah. Darth Vader. I'm sorry, I've never heard of this character. Could you go into greater detail? Was it a small independent film, perhaps? Darth Vader, of course. You know what they say, you either die the villain or live long enough to become the hero. A great example there. All right, well, they shut the doors, which means that either they're tired of hearing me or I need to start. All right. So, welcome then to Building a Better Recurring Villain, or Building a Better Villain Part 2. With Captain Mike, by a remarkable coincidence, I am Captain Mike, so I'm in the right place, and I hope so are you. I put stuff on my computer. So, just in case you weren't here for any of my other presentations, I do have the great fortune to be at MAGFest fairly regularly these days. But I am Captain Mike Clegg. I did start off with Dungeons & Dragons, and indeed, during the course of this, I will be talking about things in terms of role-playing games, but very much these apply to television series, movie series, book series, any of those things as well. But you may notice that I occasionally talk about game masters, and I talk about players, and so forth. I am a teacher. I have an MA in writing, a BA in English, years of gaming, and I'm also a teacher. I'm an English and history teacher, as you may have guessed. Oh, and I can also be reached. You'll notice at the very bottom I do include my email if you have any questions along the way, or if you are like, Mike, that was just a fantastic thing. Can I have the copy of the slides or anything like that? Feel free to email me, captainmike@captainmike.net. But you didn't come here to listen to me talk about me, which is unfortunate because that's what I'm going to do for the next 58 minutes. And along the way, I might mention the following things. The construction and maintenance of recurring villains. Recurring villains don't recur naturally, right? They're not a naturally renewable resource. But we need to consider the story mechanics, the characteristics, the story mechanics themselves, whether or not they allow for recurring villains, the characteristics of the villains themselves. What is it that makes a villain not just keep showing up, but make them a good character to keep appearing? What makes the players or the audience happy to see them again, even as they're incredibly unhappy to see them again? And how does this affect the ongoing campaign? How does this actually work with the whole mix in terms of role-playing? Or if you're more of the writery side, how does this deal with the ongoing storyline and story arcs? But it just wouldn't be one of my presentations if I did not include this panel, or this slide. This is a panel. That is a slide, Mike. Know your audience, especially true with villains, because they do villainy. That is kind of their thing. Some villains are very family-friendly. To a certain extent, Team Rocket is a great example. To a certain extent, Team Rocket is a terrible example. But indeed, there's a big difference between, say, Team Rocket and anyone from House of Dragon. I see people nodding. Like, yeah, absolutely. So you want to know your audience. If you're going for a PG game, maybe someone who shows up, murder Bloodface, they're not the character for that one. They should not be a recurring villain. Indeed, they should perhaps not show up the first time. Likewise, if you've got a party full of, of the Punisher clones, Team Rocket's not a great one to throw in because that's going to end badly. Team Rocket's really blasting off again. All right, so let's talk about story mechanics, because if there's one great place to start, it's with how things are actually put together before we start putting on the coats of paint and making everything look fancy and painting flames on the side. So story mechanics, consider, do you want your villain to be a background villain, an occasional villain, or a persistent villain? Now, within this idea, you can have a villain who's simply in the background all the time. They don't even necessarily deal with the heroes specifically. Thanos is probably a pretty good example of this. Thanos of the MCU movies, Marvel Cinematic Universe movies. In most of those movies, what does he do? He doesn't even show up in the movie itself. He shows up after the credits when half the people have left, which is not a great sign for a villain, really. But yeah, he's a background villain. He's the thing that makes things happen. He's the thing that sends out forces. But very rarely do the characters actually interact with Thanos in any kind of significant way until we get to Endgame, and then it's all Thanos all the time. Then you have the occasional recurring villain. Any of the Batman villains, any of the Spider-Man villains, so forth, these kinds of rogues gallery villains, they're occasional villains. Spider-Man isn't constantly fighting Electro, isn't constantly fighting the Chameleon, but rather each one kind of has their own day, has their own time. Sometimes they get a longer arc, sometimes they get a shorter arc, but they're not constant. They're just, they show up and it's like, the Riddler again. Oh, I switched from Spider-Man to Batman, but I should have said the Chameleon because almost everybody has the shape changer opponent for those special episodes. And then, of course, there's the persistent ones. Team Rocket, again, a great example. Cobra Commander of the old G.I. Joe cartoon. It's always them. Like, who could possibly be doing this thing? I don't know, the person who did something every week for the last 2.5 seasons. I'm putting my money on that. I'm going to go with Cobra Commander or maybe Destro with Cobra Commander. And that's fine. You can have persistent villains. It means that the two of the heroes and the villain, they just constantly bounce off of each other. Now, if you're going to do that, you definitely want to fine-tune your villains so that they work well with the hero. Otherwise, it's just this jerk who keeps showing up. There's no special connection. But any of these are fine, and they don't have to be forever. You don't have to sit down and go with a persistent villain, and then you realize after 6 sessions, your players are like, this clown again? You can mix it up, have them, take a vacation. I'm sure even the Joker takes vacations. And the next part. So I understand, speaking of Darth Vader and Star Wars movies, which will happen again, I assure you, somehow Palpatine returned? Somehow Palpatine returned. Someone got paid money for that. Nobody paid me. Yes, terrible writing, the most unnatural. Thank you for the setup, by the way. That was great. I'll slip you a $5 later.
And then somebody got paid to say it.
Yes, a lot of money. Way more to say it than to write it, which is, in my opinion, the real problem. So, and what kills me about the whole thing is that that's already a setting that supports recurring villains after death. Like, we all read the Timothy Zahn books, and we all cried when we found out that Timothy Zahn was not connected to any of the further movies. And those of you who don't know who Timothy Zahn is, go read the Timothy Zahn trilogy. Oh my goodness, I've just forgotten the name of the trilogy itself, but it's the one that introduces Grand Admiral Thrawn. Heir to the Empire. Fantastic, amazing. That's what the next movies should have been about. I'm sorry, I wandered off a bit there. I used to be a diehard Star Wars fan. Used to be. But the setting I gotta get back to what I'm actually supposed to talk about. See, I told you I was gonna talk about myself and then throw this in. But the setting must support the recurrence. You can't have a villain just come out of nowhere and be like, well, but we saw them die. It's like, well, yeah, we have parts of the body. Yeah. We took DNA samples. It was definitely them. They were dead. I was there. I did the exploding. Well, they're back. So there. Like, it's not satisfying. It's, in fact, infuriating, and it derails campaigns and apparently fan bases. So your setting must support recurrence. Now, fortunately, if you're playing role-playing games, there's a host of ways that people can come back. If you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, it's almost too easy, right? Because there's an entire field of magic about bringing people back from the dead. There's an entire spell about making things happen when certain conditions are met. It's called contingency. So, you have people who come back from the dead. You have people who clone themselves. Sci-fi is full of people being cloned. You've even got, like, teleporter clones. So that way, if you need 2 Rikers for your fanfic, you've got them. This is about villains, Mike. But what more villainous person is there than the fanfic writer? I don't know if I want to go on record as having said that, but too late now. But it has to support that recurrence. That has to make some kind of sense. Now, at the same time, we all know that if we're playing a role-playing game, we can fudge the rules of reality. We can bend this scenario. You can even introduce new concepts. But it is unfair to be like, well, this villain can come back to life, but your heroes can't. This villain came back to life, but nobody else possibly can, and no one will ever act like this is a thing that is real. It's deeply unsatisfying, so it has to support it. Catalyst villains. These are villains that make things happen. These are villains that create whatever the setting is. Thanos is another good example. He basically creates this entire series of events, this entire series of things. Trying to think of a villain that actually altered the path of the literal setting itself. And I'm coming up blank. Ooh, yes.
Reverse Flash?
Reverse Flash. Yeah, fantastic. Reverse Flash. Yes. Do books count? Yes, absolutely. I'm sorry, I don't think I caught any of that. The Lord Lulu from Mistborn. I'm not familiar with that one, but you did remind me because you mentioned books, and shame on me, The Lord of the Rings. Oh my goodness, the biggest one staring me right in the face every time I put on a ring. Sauron himself actually creates the setting. It, makes Mordor the blighted landscape that it is, sends out the orcs, like basically sets the whole thing in motion. And indeed, in terms of recurring villain, like Sauron's a pretty good one. He's definitely the big bad of the entire world of Middle-earth. But he creates that situation. So catalyst villains can be great. And they are better as recurring villains because if you're going to have someone who puts things in motion, they seem like they're kind of a tent pole of the situation. Once they're gone, it seems like the world is literally missing something because it literally is. It's missing that chunk. Moving on, we've also got the format change. We'll be going through defense to offense. If you have a recurring villain, then the tactics change. Normally, you have heroes who are very reactive. Somebody shows up, robs a bank, got to stop the villain. Somebody, bunch of evil trolls burn down a village, heroes show up, will avenge the village or stop the trolls from attacking. But if you've got a recurring villain, well, then the heroes can go on the offensive. And that changes things because now they are moving into the villain's territory. That's when you get to set up things like traps. That's when you can set up defenses and really consider some of the other aspects. But it also means that the heroes get to use completely different tactics. It's a nice change of pace sometimes. And Nemesis versus Rogues Gallery. We'll go into that in a bit more shortly. Right now, in fact. I changed the order of my slides 2 days ago. Because I'm a genius. That's right. So do my heels. So we've got Nemesis versus Rogues Gallery. So what is the difference between a Nemesis and a Rogues Gallery? Well, one is singular and one is plural. I mean, that kind of gives it away. But a Nemesis is someone who is directly opposed to the hero. There is something specific to that character, whether it is the Batman Joker, you made me what I am, you made me what I am kind of duality. It could be even something as simple as two rivals, where that rivalry has become all-consuming, where it has just become that constant, like, me versus you sort of a situation. And it doesn't have to be to the death. By the way, one of the best ways to have your villain recur is for them not to die in the first place. Super easy then. They don't even have to come back from the dead. It's like, you know. So you get that specific to a character. It can be from a character's backstory. It can be something that just happens naturally. Sometimes you have a villain that just really sticks in the craw of one of your players. Like, they're just like, oh, I hate that guy, but I want him to show up again because I hate that guy. And then I can really stick it to him. The Twisted Reflection Nemesis. This is very much the, like, we're very much the same, you and I, except for this one thing. Or this, I take things a little too far, or you don't take things too far enough. Or it's like, you chose this thing and I chose that thing, these two very minor things. And so it's a great chance for role-playing. It's a great chance for character explanation and design. Because then you can say, like, wow, what is it that makes a hero a hero? Is it that they make all of the right choices? Or is it that they make just that one choice and all of the other things also work out? Or is it just chance? Is it circumstance? Is it just that people applauded when you did this, but when I did it, they were mean? So it's a really good chance, and it can really bring out that role player, even in players who are maybe more just kind of like dice rolling players. Sometimes it's that nice chance to be like, oh man, what is the difference between you and me? We're not so different, you and I. And so that personal connection, that is that thing, because like if you've got like a bunch of trolls that show up to burn down a village, like that's not personal. I mean, even if you live in the village, it's usually not personal. It's not like the trolls were like, I hate that guy. Look at him over there with his item shop and sickle and garlic braid. Wish I had garlic. They don't let us have garlic. We're trolls. My family has longed for garlic. We've been eating terrible pasta. I'm going to burn down their house.
It turns out they're allergic to garlic, so they did all that.
Oh, I was a vampire troll the whole time. You set me up. I'll get you for this. I'm really getting into this story. The new story, the vampire troll who didn't know he was a vampire. Constantly beset upon by these monstrous adventurers. They just show up, hack off parts of my body, steal all my treasure. I've gone from treasure type B to treasure type E in a week. That's a very old joke.
I can't go in the sun either way.
I got these cool shades. No, I can't get into character design. I'll be here all day. But you need that personal connection. It isn't enough to just like show up and rob a bank. Although, man, do players hate when they are robbed from. Ooh, do they hate that. You want your players to suddenly start caring. Have that villain show up and nick something of theirs. It doesn't even have to be important, but oh, if it is. Yeah, you know, it's like, ooh, that's I rely heavily on my wand of fireballs or whatever, and it's like, yoink. Now I have a wand of fireballs, and you don't, haha. It's a very different Die Hard 2. That also had Snape in it, as I recall. But you have that personal connection. There's this one time, it's strange how personal connections can sometimes show up. But I was running a superhero game, Champions, which I don't believe is called Champions anymore. But the hero, or the villain I had created, his name was Dr. Mortius, and he was your classic guy in a thing of power armor, and he did nefarious things that largely involved breaking things. I made him to be a tough fight. For 4 to 5 heroes, I had a party of 4 to 5 heroes. I may have a little bit overestimated the party's ability to do damage. And so Dr. Mortius might have had a little too much armor and health. And he was unbeatable. I didn't mean to. It just kind of happened that way. Yeah, like whoopsie doodle. So the heroes got beat, and they got beat bad. So bad. Several times in a row, because I kept trying to give them opportunities to like defeat Dr. Mortius so they could like defeat him, and they kept not doing it. But here's the thing. Dr. Mortius rode on a giant armored motorcycle because I ran this game in the 90s, and that seemed cool at the time. I don't have a better excuse. Yes! That's the spirit. It's still cool now. Anyway, so they were fighting Dr. Mortius. They had him on the ropes, and by the ropes, I mean they had actually managed to do a tiny bit of damage. His health bar had gone down a little bit. I could almost hear everybody wishing that role-playing games had a quick save feature. But it was enough to make Dr. Mortius escape, and they made him escape not the way that he came. So he like ran off in a different direction, and they were like, he got away again. And someone turned around and said, what happened to his motorcycle? I was like, well, he left using like his secret escape route, so the motorcycle is still out front of the building. They're like, we take the motorcycle, and we're gonna hang it up in our Hall of Justice. They built a trophy room so they could put the motorcycle of the villain they had only technically defeated. It was like the liberation of France. They were ecstatic. They were like, we got him. He'll never be able to drive to another thing again. I'm like, he's still out there. Like, it's not even, this is only like a 10-point side power. This is, have your party. But it was a good time. But it made that constant beating, it really made it personal. And then he kind of became more of an, now I did tone down the armor after that one because I was like, this is ridiculous. So I toned down his armor. I let the heroes beef up their powers a little bit. Subtly, I didn't want him to suddenly show up in tinfoil, but, you know, just enough so that he could be defeated a bit more later. Yes, the bike was his hair of Samson. Did I see a question? Somebody have a question? No? Oh, yes.
I was going to say, did he ever come back to the bike? Did he ever realize they took this bike?
No, he was actually defeated in the next combat. They defeated him and they captured him, and he was, as they brought him back to their holding cell, he was like, hey, my bike. I mean, it was way more gravelly than that. I mean, he was a tough guy. Hey, my bike. You know how these people in power armor are. So all of this, what it does is it creates depth of character. The purpose of having this nemesis is really just the idea that you can have a character and they can say they're a lot of things, but until they have a chance to prove that they're that thing, until they have the chance to prove, I have the chance to break my code versus killing, but I'm not going to, until they say, yes, these things happened to me and I did this, but those same things happened to you and you chose that. That's where you create that depth. That's where you realize, oh, nothing I did was predestined, even if you're writing a book and it is predestined. It wasn't predestined to the person. They can really experience that, like, oh, wow, yeah, I could have been you, and how easily our positions could have been switched. That creates that depth of character. It's very nice. Rogues Gallery, on the other hand, not as personal, because it tends to be more of that rotating occasional villain situation. A Rogues Gallery, since it is made up of many people, should reflect the setting. The Spider-Man villains, I think, form an excellent example of this, and as indeed Batman does, because I'll, of course, be referencing Batman. Can't forget Batman. But consider Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery. They're all bright and colorful and almost entirely genetically modified in some fashion, which is true of Spider-Man as well. And indeed, the setting is one where science has gone amok. If you're reading the old comics, it's all atomic science has gone amok. If you're reading the 90s or watching the 90s cartoon, it's all genetic DNA science gone amok. And then we came back around to, what are we afraid of now? Technology. We're back to technology. It's all these computers. But you have these bright, colorful characters, and their plans are always bright and over the top and for color. It's always like, I'm going to rob this bank by stealing the building. I'm going to steal the genetic recombinator, which was a real thing in the cartoon, by airlifting it through New York. Like, come on. But of course, it's Spider-Man, you know? He's dresses in spandex, slings webs, does it in broad daylight. Now, on the other hand, you've got Batman, where everything's in the dark. But all of Batman's villains, predominantly normal... I don't want to say that. Predominantly not superpowered beings who are different flavors of crazy, all a different flavor of crazy that is found in Batman's own fruitcake of a brain. So you've got Two-Face with the idea of the duality. You've got Joker with the idea of the one bad day. You've got Poison Ivy with the red hair. Okay, not all of them fit perfectly. But you have that same idea where it's like, oh, these are all people who just, something happened to them and then they were like, I need to make a change. The question was just, what change do you make? For Batman, it was, I will enforce justice. For Poison Ivy, it is, I will enforce justice for non-humans and plants specifically. For the Joker, it was, I'm going to create change of any unvarying kinds, so forth and so on. And then you do still have those characters who are superpowered, but oftentimes those are the most normal characters. You know, the Croc's just a regular guy, but he's superpowered and ugly and dumb, depending on which version you're reading. And a cannibal. Is he a cannibal? Well, I guess because he does eat people. But, oh yes, I realize what that sounds like. I guess if you eat people, you're sort of a cannibal. But if it's for second breakfast, then Now I'm going to be on tape as having said that it's okay to eat people for second breakfast. Who's the real villain here? Is it still cannibalism if you eat a hobbit? Nope, I'm moving on. So it reflects the setting, it sets and it bolsters the tone. The Rogues Gallery, yeah, what they do is they bolster that tone. Like I said, Spider-Man's villains, they're all high-color, four-color, high-flying villains. Batman's villains, they tend to be more serious even while they're painting clown faces on things and blowing up metros. But it gives you that tone. Each one of them has that sort of like broken quality to them. And it gives that idea that the setting itself is broken. Star Wars, I'm trying to think of non-Batman and Spider-Man, but now I've started thinking about them and that's all I can think about. Other Rogues Galleries, Superman, yes, thank you. And I got so stuck on Batman. Superman, and that's a great example too, because Superman and Batman both live in the same universe, and depending on which movie you're watching, they're across the river from each other. But Superman's villains are not like Batman's villains. In fact, Batman's villains, they're just like all these crazy crackpots with crowbars. But Superman villains, they're like mighty space aliens who come looking for a fight. They're Brainiac, who's very four-color and over the top. Because Superman himself is also that. He himself is also four-color. Which is why I always love when Batman and Superman have to like switch villains or deal with each other. Because it's such an interesting tonal shift, or incredibly awkward, painful tonal shift, depending on which thing it is. But it sets and it bolsters that tone. So if you're going to have a Rogues Gallery, pick them carefully. You want them all kind of cast from the same cloth, so to speak. Cut from the same cloth, cast from the same mold. Yeah, you can pick whatever metaphor you like. But you want it to support that tone. You don't want to have like high-flying fun, incredibly depressing existential crisis, high-flying fun. It's weird. And if you are going to have someone like that, and indeed you can, I mean, Spider-Man certainly had his times where he's like, woe is me, and Batman's had those times where he's like, haha. But you want to kind of pick and choose and make sure that you set up that tone properly. Otherwise, it's going to be very jarring for your reader, for your viewer, and for your players. Because then the players are suddenly like, oh, I thought we were just having like some crash, pal, bam, and then this guy died from falling off a building. We don't know how to deal with that, nor should they. Nor should they have to. A Rogues Gallery can provide thematic adventures. If you've got a Rogues Gallery, that means that you can have the character that does the riddles. You can have the character that does the just straight out and out combat. You can have the character that does the carefully planned series of tricks and reversals. So you can have like that thing where, oh, the bank was robbed and here's a letter from the Riddler. And they're like, okay, this is going to be a thinky adventure where we have to like solve puzzles and do detective work. And then sometimes you have the the villain who comes out and it's like, I'm here and I'm big and I'm strong, and you can fight me until I stop, or I can just keep going. And sometimes, it's nice. You got to switch it up, right? It can't all be Sherlock Holmes detective mysteries, and it can't all be Rock'em Sock'em robots. You got to mix it up a little. But a rogues gallery lets you do that because then, this villain is this kind of an opponent, this villain is this kind of opponent. You can switch it up. A rogues gallery also provides consistency. Now, this may seem strange because the rogues gallery is multiple people and a nemesis is one person, so the nemesis should provide more consistency. And indeed, a nemesis does provide consistency. But a rogues gallery, having this range of people, it creates a consistency of setting. And it creates a consistency of characters. And it also means that your players, your main characters, your protagonists, they now have to bounce off of several different types of people and still prove that they're the same, which is sometimes hard. When you've got one nemesis, all you have to do is be the opposite of that nemesis. But when you've got several people who are constantly bothering you, you have to be true to yourself. Yep, you can write that on a fortune cookie. In a fortune cookie, Mike. But it provides that consistency of character, and it provides that consistency of setting. Like we talked about how Batman characters are all like Arkham Asylum types, and Spider-Man villains are all, science gone awry types. And it creates that consistency of setting as well. Cool. I should look at my clock so that I can have my clock right set up. All right, so let's talk about rivalry. Rivalry is typically non-lethal. Typically. Sometimes, people get hurt. But it is that competition. It is that competition to an extreme level. Now, this could be over, it could be over a relationship. How classic is that? But it can also be over relics, power. Someone had mentioned Dr. Robotnik from Sonic. It's always about those Chaos Emeralds, right? And it's always about I want the emeralds, and Sonic's like, no way, I'm too busy eating chili dogs, but I'm going to stop you. That's my extent of Sonic knowledge. That and gotta go fast. That's about it. But you get this kind of rivalry. And this is kind of nice because this can give you a recurring villain that appears naturally. Because if you've got a setting where you've got heroes going after some sort of MacGuffin, some sort of unobtainium, some kind of whatever, somebody else is going to want that too. And so you can either have the people work together, where's the fun in that, or you can create the rivalry, and you can create it at the last minute. The old, you toss me the idol, I'll toss you the whip sort of turnaround. Really, Mike? Raiders of the Lost Ark? Well, there's a new one coming out, so there we go. So you can have teams working together, and then at the last minute, the betrayal, or you can have someone who's like, I sent you on that quest so that way you would get it for me because I didn't want to get it. I hear somebody saying, oh. It's like, thanks for getting this stuff. Not only am I not going to pay you, but I'm going to take it from you and then use it against you. Wow, that makes it personal, right? It's like, oh, you betrayed me personally. I thought we had a deal. Strange faceless figure in the cloak in the corner of the bar that I met last night and was promised 50 gold to go into an entire dungeon. Looking back on it, that was a poor life choice. I got to really rethink my job. But oftentimes rivalries are non-lethal. They really are about attaining whatever that particular goal is. Now, they can be lethal. And certainly, if you're in Star Wars settings or sci-fi settings, Star Wars, I was thinking particularly like the Sith. If you've ever played the multiplayer or the MMORPG, the Sith side is always like, well, there's only one space for the top candidate. And if there's only one candidate left, they get it. Now, you're not allowed to kill people. Wink. But there are lots of unobserved locations in all of these places. But rivalry, they deal with that goal. It's really about the goal and not just about stopping the other person, typically at first. Oftentimes, it devolves into just, well, if I can't have it, nobody can. But it is that rivalry. Oddly enough, I just happen to think, really, the whole Gollum, Frodo, and Sam thing is really just a rivalry. They both want the same thing. They both want the ring because they want to do two very different things with it. Spoiler alert. That book's been out for a long time. Rivalry can be personal, but it can also be professional. Indeed, the classic Oh my goodness, what is the job that Lara Croft has besides killing animals? Tomb raiding. That's not the word. Archaeology. Just a matter of time between grave robbing and archaeology, indeed. 10,000 years, is that the cutoff? Good to know. So oftentimes that is professional. It may devolve again into personal, and that's perfectly fine in terms of story structure. But yeah, oftentimes it is that professional kind of equality. Even in those sort of cutthroat corporate structures, you can have that sort of professional sort of a thing. These aren't recurring villains, but I can't help but think of RoboCop. The original RoboCop, which is a fantastic movie, and I recommend it to everybody, where most of the villainy happens because people just wanted raises at work. Yeah, no, that's the motivating factor, is people just wanted to be in a better position at work, so they created more and more dangerous death robots. You know, it's don't worry, it's only fiction. I am sure there is never a real situation where in order to make money, people endangered other people's lives in a corporate structure in Detroit. Too real? Let's move on. Recurring villains need to recur. That is a core, one might argue, characteristic of a recurring villain, is the ability to show up again. So, reasons not to die. Why does the villain not die? Well, let's be honest, the best reason for a villain not to die is because they're just too cool. They're too slick, they're too fun. And so the heroes either don't kill them, the GM finds a way to bring them back, because ultimately, like, we kind of want them to show up again. Like, we don't actually want an episode of Batman to end with the Joker dying and then never coming back ever again. Well, we would have said that in the 80s, or the 90s, or the 2000s. But in many ways, oftentimes that is what keeps villains coming back, is that they're too cool. They're too much fun to have. And so they come back in one form or another. They can be too slick. They're just too wily. They're too slippery. You can't keep them down because they won't stay down. Lex Luthor is a great example, because Superman won't kill his opponents, and Lex Luthor is just too good at law. So he's like, well, you can't prove I was in that giant kryptonite-powered robot, so you must acquit. You're right. Well done, Senator Luthor. Yeah, thank you. But they may just get away too easily. Every time the heroes open up the battle tank, it's empty. Every time they track the villain all the way back to the hideout, it's empty. There's escape routes here and there. They disappear into the crowds. Sometimes they're just too slick, which can also be a special kind of infuriating, which is just what you want. Hero ethics are a great reason for heroes not to die. If your heroes kill people, it can be harder to keep the villains alive. And so you have to be a bit more creative. But, I mean, Arkham has a revolving door policy. So does Blackgate and pretty much every other prison in any superhero setting. Like, I can pick on Batman, but I don't have to. There's, Stryker's Island in Marvel, Riker's Island in Marvel. Any setting, there's going to be jailbreaks all the time. The fridge, yep. Which definitely 100% holds every supervillain. Until they don't. But hero ethics, and that's kind of a thing, a nice reason to have a recurring villain, but it can also be a good element for depth of the characters, where it's like, it is so easy to just kill an enemy. But if you're a paladin, you can't do that. And in fact, if you're a paladin, one of the best ways for your villain to not die is to say, I surrender. Yeah, a lot of villains do not want to fight to the death over something as trivial as the battle today, especially if they think, and especially if they know, they can get out of it later. So if you've got a villain who's perfectly fine with lying and conniving, or even is so savvy in law that they believe they can get off, yeah. Oh no, Paladin, you've defeated me. I surrender. Oh, this entire temple is coming down. You'd better protect your prisoner. So those hero ethics, they can really help protect your villains. And indeed, if it's not the hero ethics that are protecting them, maybe it is that the villains themselves are protected. Maybe they have connections to a mob or a gang, or they have protection from politicians. Because now I know politicians, we all know them as being entirely above the board, very responsible people, who would never ever dabble in things like super soldier serum, would never bankroll necromantic mages. Yeah, threw you off with that one. You thought I was going to do another softball one. But indeed, if you've got a D&D game, like, not all of those kings and queens are there just because everyone thinks that they should be. Sometimes they have to, like, reinforce the status quo. Or, you know, of course, kings and queens often have multiple children, and not all of their children are very patient when it comes to throne getting. There was a series about that, I think. If not, there should be. So indeed, sometimes you can't, like, kill the villain because they are protected. Or, you know, jumping down to more problematic to kill, especially if you're dealing with gang structures or corporate structures or any kind of, like, you know, systematic sort of a thing, creating a power vacuum may actually be more dangerous than letting the person live. Or by killing them, you create a situation where that law or that order is broken down. And then you have a worse problem. Batman actually does work with that most of the time, where it's just, well, yeah, but if I kill somebody, then, like, the whole game is over. Then this place becomes a police state and everybody just loses. So you may have someone who's just more problematic to kill. You may actually have a villain who's literally immortal. That is entirely plausible. And immortality comes in many different forms. There is, of course, the classic immortality where they just straight up don't die. Dracula, a fantastic example. Earlier, someone had mentioned Dracula from Castlevania, this Castlevania game series. Like, he keeps coming back. You can't keep a bad guy down. Yes? Morbius. Morbius Matt Smith? Yes, Matt Smith from Morbius. Was he unkillable? I mean, I felt like that movie went on forever. But that's not quite the same as being unkillable. Was he unkillable? Did he die at the... so much of that movie is just a blur. Thankfully. Yes?
Yeah, one classic line for, of course, immortal by a resurrecting villain is something along the lines of, so long as there is evil in this world, I shall return.
Yes, fantastic. I shall return. Yes, and so definite classic immortality. You can also have characters who are unkillable because they are gods, demigods. Mythology is full of that. Like, you can't, even if you kill them, it just doesn't seem to stick. It's like, oh yes, Thor was killed last week. Oh, how's he doing? Oh, he's much better. You know Thor. We hit him with a mountain. That's mythological Thor, not Chris Hemsworth Thor, who is, of course, much stronger than a mountain. But also consider practical immortality, such as Doctor Doom, where every time Doctor Doom is definitely 100%, absolutely no question defeated, it's a robot who thinks he's Doctor Doom. Yeah, the body double thing. Like, so and the best part about that, which I truly do love that premise, is that because Doctor Doom created body doubles that believe that they are Doctor Doom, there is no functional difference, even to themselves. Like, they still believe they're the real Doctor Doom, they're just robots. So yeah, you can have homunculi clones, any of those kinds of things. You can also have creatures from the lower planes. If you're playing Dungeons & Dragons, oftentimes defeating them on the material plane just knocks them out for like 2 or 3 years. So that's great. Then you've actually got a time limit. And you can be like, okay, when this number of years has passed, this villain's coming back for revenge. Then you can do some other adventures. Maybe your players will forget what day it is. And then suddenly, poof, ha, you weren't expecting me. And then they'll be like, who are you? Yes? The clash of ideology, or just the idea that they're so difficult to defeat or immortal that, like, you just have to be like, go away. Villain. Babylon 5, which I didn't see. But I will believe. But indeed, there are many villains where it's just they are either too difficult to defeat or too impossible to defeat. So all you can really do is either set them on somebody else or convince them that you're not worth the trouble. You'd think I'd have seen Babylon 5, but instead I'm going to reference Squirrel Girl when she talks Galactus out of eating Earth. Like, Squirrel Girl can't defeat Galactus, except in her own comic when she did. But yes, how do you defeat Galactus? Is like, well, you can't just like punch him enough. And so he's just like, yeah, you shouldn't eat Earth because it's a great place and it has all this stuff. And you just convince them to go somewhere else. Yes? Oh, Mixoldblix. Yeah. Yeah, you have to just basically convince him to say his name, and you just trick him into leaving. So there's lots of instances where we have characters where it's like, yeah, you don't actually defeat them, you just get them to go away, which is a kind of a defeat. Not all defeats have to end in death. Yes? Yes, Vegeta. You're ahead of me. Now, that's okay. Vegeta is a fantastic example. This is could Goku have defeated, well, he did defeat Vegeta. Could Goku have killed Vegeta? Maybe. But honestly, like, it's really more trouble than it's worth. It's easier to convince somebody to join your own side. And so certainly they become recurring. Of course, at that point, are they really still villains? Vegeta would say yes, but everyone else would say no. My favorite line remains, finally, these dryers take forever. So speaking of recurring, so the villain has survived their foray against the heroes somehow, but they need to have a reason to return, because otherwise they're just showing up for a cameo, which is fun, but it's not really a recurring villainy sort of a thing. So there needs to be a reason to return. Now, it could be that the villain has an agenda. It could be that the villain has a plot, and the heroes defeat the villain in the sense that they have foiled the plot, but not the overall plan. So if you have a villain whose plan is to conquer the tri-state area, you may have a hero that thwarts the particular device, some sort of innator, if you will. And indeed, your hero might be semi-aquatic, possibly teal. I'm referencing Phineas and Ferb, of course, which if you haven't seen, I do recommend. And so you have this ongoing plan. So even though there's that one thing where it's like, I was foiled today, but tomorrow I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to come up with a better plan. Sometimes the plan is to create a thing that furthers the agenda. Sometimes the plan is to create a thing that traps the heroes. Sometimes you get something that does both. Consistently useful. Did I write that right? The villain has to be consistently useful? No, the villain has to be consistently useful to the plot. Or the villain has to have something that they need that is consistently useful. So there needs to be some sort of reason for them to actually be in this situation. This is, again, going back to the idea of getting that MacGuffin, getting that unobtainium, or getting whatever it is, the Chaos Emeralds, or the Havoc Rubies, or the Extreme Displeasure Opals. Whatever you're using. And of course, now it's personal. This is a good one if you've got a villain that you did not intend to make a recurring villain, but they got away somehow anyway. In fact, this actually happened to me. I ended up with oh my God, how long did that thing go on? I think it was a 3-year-long campaign when I was in high school, which was great because none of us had any jobs, but we all had weekends free. To be young and unemployed. Typically, I'm only one or the other. So, but yeah, I had a very classic, it was just supposed to be like a one-off afternoon. It was like a summer afternoon playing Dungeons and Dragons with your friends. Like, what more classic kind of a concept is that? But I had this necromancer, and he had a demon familiar, and the heroes didn't actually completely stop everything. They killed the necromancer, and the demon familiar fled, and they were like, we solved the problem. The army that he was raising and the problems, they're all done. And I was like, yeah, but that demon was very clever. Necromancer. So he showed up again. So then the adventure was the demon trying to bring back his master. And then it was the necromancer who learned that death is a problem, but not one you can't overcome with enough magic and bloody-mindedness. And so it became a much more personal sort of a thing. And so it became that sort of like, well, what's more personal? You killed me. You stabbed me on purpose. I was there. And so it became personal. And how many heroes find themselves going up against villains where the villain's primary motivation is just to get the hero, to defeat the hero? And that's even leaving out things like Bane and the Heath Ledger Joker, where it's like, well, we'll kill the Batman because he's so powerful. Or it's just personal. Actually, still the Joker, but going back to the Jack Nicholson Joker. Like, he hated Batman because Batman made him the Joker. Very personal. It was after that. And of course, one of the strangest reasons to return is coincidence. This may seem out of line because usually I'm like, things should be very carefully planned. But sometimes it is a coincidence. This is especially good with rivalries, where it's just, what are you doing here? Well, I'm here for the thing. What are you doing here? I'm also here for the thing. and then you get like the two shots of the anime style like stairs, top and bottom. You know where I'm going with this. The lightning in the background. Come to think of it, Pokemon relies entirely on this. Almost entirely. Sometimes it's about specifically getting Pikachu, but many times Team Rocket shows up and they're just like, we're here to get this MacGuffin-ion. And, and they're, MacGuffin-ion. Didn't expect that evolution. And then Team Rocket is like, yes, but we're also here. And oh no, it's the twerps. So this may seem unlikely, but it is a very usable premise. And this is nice for those times, especially when it's a more low-key sort of a thing, where it's not just like stabbing each other in the throat. So rivalry is very good. And sometimes it's just like that sort of odd coincidence. I'm trying to remember. Shocker from Spider-Man became very much a coincidental villain. He didn't set out to like commit crimes and then fight Spider-Man or like anything big. It was always... especially in the Ultimate series, it was always like, how are you always here? And Spider-Man's like, you keep robbing places in Queens. Like, go to a different city. This is like the 5th time. So you get these kind of odd coincidences, but they're still recurring villains. And they're very nice. They're especially nice for coincidence if you're just trying to set the scene, get everybody into the game, or even just familiarize people with the rules in combat and so forth. So if you've got like a new player coming in, it's like, oh, by coincidence, this bank's being robbed by the Shocker. Again. Well, the first time was just to case the joint and rob it a little. Futurama, Roberto. So the ongoing campaign, how do recurring villains mesh with everything as that goes on? Well, if you've got a villain that you want to make recurring, give them escape plans so they can recur. But indeed, villains should have escape plans. If you're planning to take over the world, you have to be extremely high on the megalomania to not put in a back door. And certainly you may have villains who do not take their evacuation route. Evacuate in our moment of triumph. I think you overestimate their chances. And then Moff Tarkin was never seen again until a prequel. But then you have characters that are like, oh, things are going badly, so I'm out of here, and I may blow up the place while I leave. Boop, see ya. But that's what villains do, especially if you have very clever villains, or if you have villains that have been defeated a couple of times and have gotten away kind of by accident or by pure chance. They'll build escape plans. They may have many, many escape plans, and the escape plans may even be more convoluted and dastardly than the villainy in the first place. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. This doesn't just refer to the villains, it refers to the heroes. Now, especially in role-playing games, I think we tend to get into the pattern where the heroes win. That's what you show up for. But sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Sometimes it's better to have the villain win because that makes the heroes really bring it back together. Like, ooh, we can't just go in, no plan, half-cocked, and start blasting away. We need to actually have a plan. This may also help players realize when you've got an especially clever villain who's prepared for things and is not just, oh, I thought I'd rob this bank in New York. And I'm sure Spider-Man, Daredevil, the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, Iron Man, none of them will show up. Indeed, one of my favorite lines from the animated Superman adventures was when two people are robbing a museum and Superman shows up and they shoot him. And he just looks at them and says, are you new here? That's a direct quote. That's an actual line. It is my favorite line. Just, are you new here? Like, he's not even annoyed. Like, he's just confused. So, but yeah, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. And indeed, the villains themselves may recognize that as well. Sometimes they can win a little bit. Sometimes they win one part of the thing, but they lose another part. It's the whole, like, look for the war, not the battle. And Pyrrhic victories may be a big part of that, where nobody wins. Like, you stop the villain, but at what cost? It's like, we did it, Patrick, we saved the city. And meanwhile, everything is burning down. And so you may have these situations. If you're looking for a recurring villain and you want a reason for things to carry on, the heroes have to lose sometimes, at least a little bit. Megatron. If anybody remembers the 80s Transformers, Megatron actually won a fair number of times. Not 100%, very rarely 100%. But, he'd get some energon, he would do this kind of a thing. He had enough to kind of keep going. And you need enough to keep those villains going because villainy is expensive. Like, those henchmen don't hire themselves. Giant death rays, I mean, you got to pay for the parts and the plutonium and paying off the, dangerous scientists and so forth. It's pricey. There's a reason banks get robbed usually first thing. Team-ups can be so much fun, especially if you set up some villains to have different levels of villainy or different levels of evil. You may have many villains that their job is just that, they're trying to work here. They're trying to make some money. They're not here to destroy the world. But you have others who are like, they're not here for the money. They want to watch the world burn. So I actually had a Christmas special for my superhero campaign where the power was knocked out because some villains were like, it's the dead of winter and we're going to knock out the power and we're going to freeze out the town because we hate them. And other villains were like, we can't let this go on because we can't, like, we live here, man. This is, our power is out. And one villain in particular, Jurassic Jack, the dinosaur man. Yeah. Jurassic Jack, the dinosaur man. He was a professional goon. He started smashing up Main Street to attract the attention of the heroes. When they showed up, he was like, oh, thank goodness you're here. I need your help to go save the town because someone's messing with the power plant. And so they teamed up for Christmas because the dinosaur man was like, my parents are in assisted living. Like, they can't not have power. And they were like, oh, we thought you were a big dumb idiot that punched out a train. And he's like, yeah, with parents. And they're old, let's go. So you can have these kinds of team-ups. That's the advantage of recurring villains, is you get that extra personality, you get that extra level of like what they will do, what they won't do, where you can trust them, when you can't trust them, when you can trust them to be themselves, those sorts of things. So you can have some fun with that, because some villains hate other villains and some villains like other villains. And you can also do like a Sinister Six sort of a thing, or where you get a bunch of villains working together after a while. It's a lot of fun. But sometimes the fun has to come to an end, so let's talk about retirement. Very quickly. Retirement, sometimes villains, they have to stop. They either become too tired or too dead or too power drained, and they have to move on. So they can either just be the end of the arc, and you can just be like, oh, it's the end of the season, it's the end of the series, it's the end of the campaign. The villain has kept up the good fight for long enough, or the bad fight, I suppose, I should say. And now it's just, it's time for them to be done, and we move on to another villain. And that's fine. I think it's important that villains have a time when they end. Anybody here a fan of the Arkham series of Batman games? Arkham Asylum, Arkham City, and Arkham Knight, I suppose. How fantastic was that they gave a villain, whom I will not mention, sort of like an ending arc. Fantastic. One of my favorite villains, and I was like, I couldn't think of a better way for this to end. Fantastic. Well done. Wish they had kept it up. But then there's also passing the torch. Now, your recurring villains, they may themselves be personally recurring, but in the same way that you get like kids of heroes who become heroes, you get kids of villains who become villains, or just the next generation of villains. Batman Beyond is basically made out of passing the torch villains. And so you just go like, okay, well, I may be Dr. Devastator Destroyer, but I'm getting too old for this, so I will pass it down to you, Dr. Devastator Destroyer Jr., the second. And indeed, as heroes become retired, you can change the focus and the tone of the campaign itself. Maybe you're just tired of having a grim and gritty campaign, and you're ready for something more four-color and more high-flying, or vice versa. Maybe you've started off goofy, but as you and your gaming group have changed tones and changed tastes, maybe you're ready for something more gritty. You're ready to go from the 60s Cesar Romero Joker to the 80s Joker, or God help us, the 90s Joker, which was so gritty you'd think he spit gravel. All of which is perfectly fine, because that, you need to keep things changing, you need to keep things fresh, you need to keep things evolving. And so all of those are perfectly good reasons to retire villains and introduce new ones, either as new versions of the old ones or just as simply new villains. Let the villains have their own arcs. All right. Oh, yes, that is indeed my last slide. I do have a few minutes left for some closing questions, but first I do wish to say thank you to all of you. This is unfortunately for this MAGFest, it is my last presentation, but I will be hopefully doing presentations more in the future. Oh, and yes, thank you. A reminder that feel free on the guidebook to give me a nice 5-star review if you enjoyed this performance, because it does allow me to come back and do more. And it is also a great boost to the ego. What better reason could there possibly be? But yes, and indeed, thank you very much. I am and remain Captain Mike. I will remain for some questions, but thank you very much. All right, we do have a few minutes for questions. Anybody have any questions? Yes?
I was wondering, did I miss it when you went over Pyrrhic?
Pyrrhic victories? A Pyrrhic victory is a victory where nobody really wins.
Okay.
Like, it's a victory, but like at what cost? Usually it's at an extreme cost where it's as costly to win as it is to lose.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So like if you can stop the villain's plans, but only by destroying everything the villain was about to destroy anyway, it's like, well, I guess we won. Or you stop the villain, but like you lost 3 of your teammates. Like, was it worth it? If afterwards you say, was it worth it? That's usually a good sign of a Pyrrhic victory. You technically won. Yes?
You mentioned this ending of recurring villains after passing the torch. But I wonder, I saw a hybridization there that you could have a sort of a goofier, less competent recurring villain.
Oh, yes.
Turns out, there's the reason but they got resources far beyond their actual ability to handle. Of course, there's a bigger villain waiting who's been preparing to pass the torch to this new one for a while.
Oh,
They're the one thankful.
yes. So you kind of have like the bumbling trainee, and then you've got someone who's like, okay, we'll give them time. We'll let them cut their teeth on this, and then they'll get their real villain chops. That can actually be pretty good. It's almost Shakespearean if it turns out that the bumbling villain actually turns out to be incredibly brilliant. Oh my goodness, I can't remember which of Shakespeare's plays it was. I want to say it was Henry the something, where the prince is like, yes, of course I do nothing and I sleep late and I go out to parties because then when I become prince, no one will see me coming. And I was like, oh yeah, that's very nice. It would have been a much better literary reference if I had remembered the name or the play. But it was by Shakespeare, so I'm going with that. But yeah, and how fantastic would that be? And that can actually work both ways, because you can also have the bumbling fool who like never quite makes it until like the big bad actually steps in and is like, out of the way. This is how you do it. And then shows up and is like a real force of terror.
Or even just shows up as, would you like some help?
Would you like some help? I'm here with some tanks.
Like some kind of nefarious clippy.
And oh my god, a nefarious Clippy. Ugh. That's terrifying enough on its own. Looks like you're committing some evil. Would you like some help with that? Yes? Yes, absolutely. You get that power vacuum and then you've got somebody else stepping in. That's especially handy if it's some sort of device or something or symbol that they can take on. And then they just like step up and it's like, well, now I'm in charge. And then you end up with something that's similar, but oftentimes a little bit different. And sometimes it's different in all the worst ways. It's like, oh, we didn't know how good we had it. We had that easily predictable villain, and now we've got this jerk who just does crazy stuff to no great advantage. All right, well, that is unfortunately my full time, so I'll be packing up, but do feel free to come up and say hi to me, or indeed for the rest of the convention, I look very much like I am now. And I don't know why I say that. That's a ridiculous thing to say. But thank you all very much for coming out.